When my friend and I booked the cabin on Airbnb, we thought it would be the perfect getaway. Both of us had been working long hours and wanted a few days to disconnect from everything. No office calls, no constant notifications, no stress. The listing described it as a small but cozy cabin tucked away in the woods, with a fire pit, a porch, and hiking trails nearby. It sounded simple, quiet, and exactly what we needed. We knew going in that there would be no cell service. The host had written that clearly in the description, and we thought that was part of the appeal. We wanted to unplug, and the cabin was supposed to have electricity, running water, and a landline in case of emergencies. That felt safe enough. The photos made it look rustic but comfortable, just a small wooden place with a porch and 2 rocking chairs. The drive there took longer than expected. Once we turned off the main road, we had to follow a winding dirt track that seemed to go on forever. The forest grew denser the farther we went, the trees pressing in close on both sides. There were no other houses or cabins along the way, at least not that we could see. By the time we reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already starting to sink. The cabin itself looked exactly like the pictures. Small, square, made of weathered wood, with a pitched roof and smoke stains from the chimney. The porch wrapped around the front, and a couple of old chairs sat facing the trees. Behind it, the woods stretched endlessly in every direction. It was isolated, but at first it didn't feel threatening, just quiet in a way that city life never was. The first night passed without anything unusual. We unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat on the porch for a while listening to the sounds of the woods. There was a steady chorus of crickets, the occasional call of an owl, and once in a while, something rustling far off in the brush. It all felt normal. The night sky was so dark that the stars seemed sharper than I'd ever seen them. I fell asleep easily in the cabin's small bedroom, the silence around us deep and heavy. The next day, we spent the morning hiking one of the nearby trails. Without service, we had printed maps, and we followed a loop that wound through the woods and back to the cabin. We didn't see a single other person the whole time. That was something I noticed but didn't think too hard about. It was nice to have the woods to ourselves. By the time we got back, we were tired and hungry. That evening, while the light outside was fading, we started cooking dinner. The small kitchen had a gas stove and a counter just big enough for the basics. I was cutting vegetables while my friend stirred something on the stove. The cabin smelled warm and homey from the food, the windows fogging slightly from the heat inside compared to the cool air outside. That was when we heard it. Footsteps. At first, it was faint, just a crunch on the dry leaves outside. We both paused, listening. My first thought was that it was an animal. We were in the woods, after all. Deer, raccoons, even bears weren't out of the question. But then it came again. Another crunch. Then another. Slow, deliberate. The kind of steady rhythm that didn't sound like an animal scurrying around, but like a person walking. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I set down the knife I was holding and glanced toward the nearest window. The curtains were drawn, but the thin fabric didn't block out everything. That was when I saw it. A beam of light sweeping across the curtains, cutting through the dimness of the cabin. A flashlight. Someone was outside. We both froze. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. The only sound was the faint bubbling from the pan on the stove. The flashlight beam moved slowly across one window, then disappeared. A moment later, it reappeared at another window, as though the person was circling the cabin. I stayed completely still, hardly breathing, my eyes fixed on the curtain. The footsteps moved around the porch, heavier now against the wooden boards. The sound was slow, deliberate, not hurried like someone lost or looking for help. It felt methodical. Whoever it was, they were studying the cabin, checking it. The light paused near the window by the kitchen. The beam hovered there for a second, aimed straight in through the thin curtain. I knew they couldn't see us clearly unless they pressed their face against the glass, but it didn't make me feel any safer. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat loud and sharp in the silence. Finally, the beam moved away. We sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. Slowly, the footsteps faded. The crunch of leaves grew softer until we couldn't hear anything at all. We didn't move for a long time. Neither of us wanted to draw attention to ourselves if whoever it was still nearby. Eventually, we turned off the stove and let the food sit, untouched. I don't think either of us had any appetite left. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made me flinch. I kept imagining the sound of footsteps returning, or the beam of the flashlight cutting through the curtains again. When morning came, the forest outside was damp with dew. We stepped onto the porch cautiously, scanning the trees. First, everything looked normal. Then we saw them, boot prints. They were everywhere, pressed into the dirt around the porch, along the side of the cabin, even near the windows where we'd seen the flashlight beam pause. The prints were clear, large, and unmistakably human. Whoever it was had circled the cabin more than once, coming right up to the windows and standing there. Seeing those prints made my stomach drop. It confirmed what I had tried to convince myself wasn't real the night before. Someone had been outside, walking around, shining a light inside while we were there. Later, when we checked out and returned the key, the owner asked if everything had been okay. That was when we mentioned what happened. They didn't look surprised. Instead, they told us the cabin had been broken into before, usually by squatters who thought it was abandoned. They had repaired the damage and listed it again, but sometimes people still came by at night. That explanation made sense, but it didn't make it any less unsettling. The idea that someone thought the cabin was empty, or worse, didn't care if it was, left me cold. We were lucky. Whoever it was hadn't tried the door, hadn't broken a window, hadn't pushed their way inside. They just walked around, shining a light, leaving prints in the dirt. But the thought of how close they had come, just on the other side of thin walls and thin curtains, was enough. When I think back on it, what unsettled me most wasn't the footsteps, or even the flashlight. It was the prints in the morning, proof of just how close a stranger had come while we were standing inside, only feet away. I haven't stayed in an isolated Airbnb since. I booked an Airbnb apartment in an old building while traveling for work. At first glance, everything seemed normal, clean, minimal, though definitely a bit outdated. The building itself had the kind of charm that older city apartments usually carry. High ceilings, worn wood floors that creaked when you stepped in certain spots, and tall windows with frames painted over too many times. It was the kind of place where the hallways smelled faintly of dust and old varnish, where every door looked the same except for different colored mats in front of them. I'd been moving around a lot for work lately, usually picking the cheapest places I could find that still had decent reviews. This one was priced well below the other listings in the same part of the city, and I figured that was just because of its age. The photos showed a small living room, a kitchenette, and a single bedroom. It wasn't fancy, but it looked clean enough, and I only needed it for a couple of nights anyway. When I first checked in, nothing felt off. The lock worked, the Wi-Fi connected, and the place smelled faintly of lemon cleaning spray. The furniture was old, mismatched, like a mix of things pulled from garage sales, but it was arranged neatly. A stiff couch against one wall, a small square dining table pushed under a window, and a dresser in the bedroom that looked at least 20 years old. Everything was just slightly dated, but not uncomfortable. The first night went by without any issues. I worked late on my laptop, made a quick dinner on the little electric stove, and went to bed. The only thing I really noticed was that the street outside was quiet. Too quiet, actually. The building was downtown, and I had expected to hear the occasional car or at least people walking by. Instead, the nights were eerily silent, except for the occasional creak of the building itself settling. On the second night, things changed. I was sitting on the bed, scrolling on my phone, when I realized my battery was about to die. I grabbed my charger and bent down behind the dresser to find the outlet. The first thing I noticed was that the outlet felt loose, like the whole socket shifted when I plugged my charger in. I frowned and pulled the cord back out, planning to maybe try another outlet. Out of curiosity, I pushed the dresser an inch to the side to get a better look. That's when I froze. Behind the dresser wasn't just the wall, it was a door. A very narrow door, maybe just wide enough for one person to fit through. The frame had been painted the same dull beige as the wall, and someone had gone out of their way to paint over the edges, almost like they wanted it to blend in. but the handle was still there, a simple old-fashioned brass knob sticking out. My first thought was that maybe it was some kind of utility closet. But why would they cover it up with furniture? And why paint over the seams? I crouched there for a moment, staring at it, my phone charger dangling from my hand. Finally, curiosity got the better of me and I reached for the knob. Turned only slightly before catching. Locked. The discovery unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't that there was a door. Lots of old apartments had weird layouts, extra closets, even connecting doors from when buildings used to be boarding houses. What bothered me was that this one had been hidden, shoved behind a dresser and painted over like someone didn't want me to know it existed. I pushed the dresser back into place, plugged my charger in, and told myself not to overthink it. But the image of that narrow, hidden door stuck with me all evening. I tried to distract myself with work, with television, with anything else, but every time the apartment creaked or shifted, I found myself glancing at the dresser. It sat there against the wall, unmoving, but I couldn't shake the thought of what was behind it. That night, I had a hard time falling asleep. The apartment was too quiet, and I couldn't stop listening. At some point, I must have drifted off, but I woke up again around 2 a.m. to a sound that made my chest tighten instantly. It was faint but distinct, a soft clicking sound. It was coming from the direction of the dresser. I froze in bed, barely breathing. The sound came again, rhythmic and deliberate, like metal being tested. A latch. Someone on the other side of that hidden door was trying the lock. The noise wasn't constant. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again. A click, then another, slow and patient, as if whoever or whatever was testing it quietly, hoping I wouldn't notice. My mind raced. The rational part of me told myself it was just the old building. Pipes, heating, maybe even mice. But I couldn't ignore what it actually sounded like. It was the sound of someone carefully trying a locked door. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and walked to the dresser. My hands shook as I shoved it back into place, pressing it tight against the wall to cover the hidden frame completely. The sound stopped. I went back to bed, but there was no chance I was going to sleep again. I lay there with my eyes open until the first pale light of morning crept in through the window. Every little creak of the building kept me on edge, my body tense, waiting for another sound from that door. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things. I didn't even shower. I threw everything back into my bag, checked out hours earlier than I was supposed to, and left the key on the table. I didn't bother explaining to the host. I didn't want to. Outside, the city noise felt like a relief. The normal hum of traffic, the sound of people walking, even the sirens in the distance. It all felt safe compared to the silence of that apartment. For the rest of the trip, I paid extra to stay in a hotel. The kind with a front desk, cameras in the lobby, and plenty of people around. I never left a review for that Airbnb. I couldn't figure out how to word it without sounding paranoid. I told myself it was probably nothing, just an old locked door that I spooked myself over. But deep down, I knew what I heard. The soft, patient sound of someone testing the latch, right on the other side of the wall where I was trying to sleep. That was enough. I never booked another Airbnb again. I booked the Airbnb because I needed time away. My apartment felt like a box. Loud neighbors on both sides, traffic screaming all night, constant distractions. Couldn't think, couldn't rest. I kept telling myself a short break somewhere quiet would reset me. I didn't want a hotel where people were always moving around. I wanted a place that felt cut off, a house where I could stay alone and have room to breathe. After scrolling for hours, I found a listing that caught my eye. It was a small guest house outside a rural town, a standalone place that looked simple but neat. The pictures showed a white house with faded shutters, a gravel driveway, a patch of trees around the property, and a porch swing out front. The listing description emphasized privacy, saying the property was tucked back off the road and surrounded by acres of woods. That was exactly what I wanted. The price was cheaper than most, too. I didn't even hesitate. I booked 4 nights. The drive was easy at first, but as I got closer to the address, the road narrowed. Pavement turned to cracked asphalt, then to gravel. My GPS cut out when I turned down the final road, and I had to trust the owner's written directions. The road twisted through a thick line of trees, the light dropping fast behind me as the sun sank low. It felt like I was driving deeper and deeper away from the rest of the world. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I saw the house sitting at the far end of the gravel stretch. It looked older than the pictures, paint peeling in places, grass tall at the edges where it met the tree line. A single porch light glowed dimly, the only spot of warmth in the shadow of the woods. I parked and sat for a moment with the engine off. The quiet was almost suffocating. No cars, no voices, no hum of anything mechanical. Just the chirp of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It should have felt peaceful, but instead it felt like the air was pressing down on me. Inside, the house was clean but bare. The furniture looked mismatched, a couch that sagged a little, a wooden coffee table with scratches, a bed with a thin quilt stretched tight across it. The kitchen smelled faintly of bleach, like someone had scrubbed it hard not long ago. I walked through every room, flipping on lights, checking corners. Everything was in place, but it felt like no one had lived there for a long time. The first night passed quietly. I cooked a simple meal, sat on the porch swing for a while, and then went to bed early. The woods around the property were alive with small noises. Frogs, crickets, the distant call of something I couldn't name. I lay in bed listening until I drifted off. It was the second night when things started to feel wrong. I woke suddenly, no idea why. The room was pitch dark, and for a moment I just lay there, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard it, a crunch outside, sharp against the gravel driveway. My chest tightened instantly. At first I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a stray dog. But the sound came again. Slow, steady steps, too heavy, too deliberate. Gravel shifting under weight. I didn't move, my ears strained for every sound. The footsteps reached the porch, and the boards creaked faintly under pressure. My throat went dry, the sound stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. Minutes passed. My body was locked in place, terrified that the faintest shift of the bed sheets would make a noise. Eventually, I heard the footsteps again, moving slowly around the side of the house. They crunched through grass now, softer but still deliberate. Then silence again. I must have laid there for hours, waiting, ears tuned so hard they hurt. At some point, the exhaustion won out, and I slipped back into sleep. The next morning, I forced myself outside to check. My stomach dropped the moment I looked down at the gravel. Prints, clear shoe prints, larger than mine, pressed deep into the driveway. They trailed from the road to the porch and around the side of the house. I walked the perimeter slowly. The prints circled the house completely, stopping once at the back door, then continuing back toward the tree line. My pulse pounded hard in my neck. Whoever it was had come right up to the house in the middle of the night while I was asleep inside. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was the owner checking on something. Maybe someone had gotten lost. But why circle the house? Why walk the entire perimeter and then leave? It didn't make sense. I spent the day restless. Every sound outside made me twitch. When evening came, I locked the doors twice, pulled all the curtains shut, and sat in the living room with the lights off, just listening. Around midnight, it started again. The crunch of footsteps on gravel. My body stiffened immediately. The steps came closer, slow and unhurried. This time, I was awake to hear everything clearly. The porch boards creaked again under weight. Then came a sound that turned my stomach cold. The soft rattle of the doorknob. Someone testing it, twisting lightly, pausing, then twisting again. I sat frozen in the dark, heart slamming so hard I thought it might give me away. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then the scrape of something against the siding, faint but deliberate. Whoever it was moved slowly along the wall, brushing or dragging something against the surface. Around the window, around the corner, circling again. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I opened the door just enough to look outside. More prints, fresh, clear, right up to the door, pressed into the dirt where someone had stood for minutes. On the siding, faint scratch marks that hadn't been there before. I packed my bag immediately, throwing clothes in without folding, grabbing everything I had scattered through the house. My mind screamed at me to leave. When I stepped outside, the morning was gray and damp. The driveway stretched empty toward the trees, but I felt eyes on me. I hurried to the car, shoved my bag in the back, and froze. On the driver's side, just below the window, smeared faintly across the glass, was the print of a hand. I didn't think. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands shook on the wheel as I pulled out of the driveway. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to step out from the tree line and block the road. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until I hit the highway, until I saw traffic, gas stations, people. Only then did my chest loosen enough to breathe. I never left a review. I never contacted the host. I didn't want to explain what I had seen, what I had heard, what had circled that house in the middle of the night. But I can't stop thinking about it. The footsteps, the prints, the doorknob rattling, and that handprint on the glass, smeared as if someone had leaned in close, staring inside. They hadn't come to the property by accident. They had been watching, waiting, testing, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't think the lock would have held. I booked the Airbnb because I needed a break from my routine. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the noise of the city, where I could work on a few things without distraction. Hotels felt too sterile, too impersonal, and overpriced for what they offered. An Airbnb seemed like the better choice. I looked through dozens of listings before I settled on one that seemed almost too good to be true. It was a small house outside of town, sitting on several acres of wooded land, the description said. The pictures showed a modest place, clean and minimal, with a little porch and big windows that looked out into the trees. The owner advertised it as the perfect getaway for privacy, focus, and rest. That sounded like exactly what I wanted. The drive out there was easy at first, just highways and then a few back roads, but once I got closer, the road narrowed. It twisted through stretches of forest, no houses in sight, no traffic. By the time I reached the driveway, the sun had dipped low and the woods had gone dark. The driveway itself was long, almost half a mile of gravel that wound through tall trees before opening up to the property. The house looked just like the pictures. A small single-story place, pale siding, a porch light glowing softly, welcoming but lonely. It was clear the nearest neighbor was nowhere close. I pulled in, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment. The quiet was heavy. No cars, no people, just the faint chirp of insects and the creak of trees shifting in the wind. Inside, the place was neat, but there was something about it that felt staged, like it was too clean, too perfectly arranged. The furniture looked barely used. The couch had no sag, no wear. The kitchen counters were spotless. No crumbs, no stains. Even the fridge looked like it had been scrubbed down that same morning. It wasn't bad, just unnerving in a way. The first night went smoothly enough. I unpacked, cooked something simple, and sat outside on the porch for a while. The stars were visible, clearer than I'd seen them in years. I heard an owl somewhere in the woods, and once in a while, branches cracked in the distance, probably deer moving around. Eventually, I went to bed. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke up. At first, I didn't know what pulled me from sleep. The room was silent, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every little sound your body makes, the shift of sheets, your own breath. I lay there, trying to calm the uneasy feeling crawling up my chest. Then I realized what it was: the fridge. Earlier, I had noticed the faint hum of the refrigerator motor in the background when I unpacked groceries. That night, it was off. No hum, no click, no running cycle. Just silence. Shouldn't have stood out, but it did. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was between cycles. Maybe I was just being weird about it. But I couldn't shake the sense that the house was holding its breath. I eventually drifted off again. The next morning, I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The gravel driveway was quiet. The woods were still. As I stood there sipping from my mug, I noticed something strange in the dirt near the side of the house. Footprints. At first, I thought they were mine from unloading the car the night before. But when I crouched down, I realized they weren't. These prints were larger, heavier. They went along the side of the house and then stopped right below one of the windows. I felt a cold drop in my stomach. They weren't old either. The rain from 2 days ago hadn't filled them in, which meant they were recent. I walked the perimeter of the house slowly, scanning the ground. More prints circled the back, stopping at another window, then continued back toward the trees. Whoever it was had been close. Too close. I told myself maybe it was just the owner checking on the property, though it didn't make sense they would come at night. Still, I needed a reason, and that was the one I clung to. The day passed quietly. I worked on my laptop, went for a walk down the long driveway, tried to shake the unease. When night came, I checked all the doors twice, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to sleep early. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. This time, I knew what woke me. A sound, faint but there, a crunch of gravel outside. My chest tightened. I lay there, straining my ears. Another crunch, closer this time. Someone was on the driveway. No cars, no headlights, just footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound moved past the porch, then stopped. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I imagined someone standing there, just outside the window, listening. Minutes crawled by. Then came a soft scrape against the siding, like fingers or something blunt brushing along the wall, moving from one side of the house to the other, pausing at each window, testing. My skin was ice. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I forced myself to look. More prints, clearer this time. They circled the house again, deep impressions in the dirt. My stomach twisted when I saw the marks near the back door. Scuff marks, as if someone had pressed against it, maybe testing the lock. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I told myself it was fine, that maybe it was some hunter, maybe a neighbor cutting through the woods. I didn't want to admit I was scared. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the couch with all the lights off, staring at the front door. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps, closer this time, more confident. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They walked around the house slowly. I could hear the boards on the porch creak under their weight. Then came the sound I had dreaded, the rattle of the doorknob. I froze, every muscle locked. The knob turned once, twice, testing. The door held. Silence followed, but not for long. Scraping sounds started against the back door, then against the windows. Whoever it was circling, trying every possible way in. I sat there in the dark, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Eventually, the noises faded. Hours passed before I dared to move. At dawn, I packed my things as fast as I could. My hands shook as I shoved clothes into my bag. I didn't care about folding, I didn't care about order. I just needed to leave. When I stepped outside, the air was cold and damp. That's when I saw it. In the dirt near the driver's side of my car, prints. Large, fresh, pressed so deep into the soil that I knew they hadn't been there long. Whoever it was had stood there, right beside my car, waiting. I didn't waste another second. I threw my bag into the back seat, locked the doors, and drove down that long gravel driveway without looking back. My hands gripped the wheel so hard they ached. My eyes flicked constantly to the mirrors, convinced I'd see someone step out from the trees. When I finally hit the main road, I didn't slow down. I drove until I reached town, until I saw other cars, other people, lights, noise, life. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never reported it. I didn't leave a review, didn't contact the owner, didn't say a word. I just wanted to forget, but I can't, because I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Someone had been there, circling that house, testing the doors, waiting. And the worst part, the tracks by my car. They weren't leaving. They were waiting for me to come out. I booked the Airbnb because it was cheaper than a hotel and it looked private. The pictures showed a small cabin tucked in the woods, built with old timber but renovated just enough to look comfortable. There was a little deck out front with a bench, and the listing mentioned that you could sometimes hear animals at night since it was far from the nearest town. That didn't bother me. I thought it would be peaceful. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, and I wanted somewhere quiet to reset. The drive there felt longer than I expected. Once I turned off the main road, I had to follow a narrow dirt path with potholes, overgrown brush scraping against the side of my car. My GPS lost signal halfway down the track, and for a moment I thought I had taken a wrong turn. But eventually, I saw the cabin through the trees. It looked the same as in the photos. Secluded, quiet, and almost too still. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke, though the fireplace was cold. The place was simple. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a couch that sagged in the middle. The air felt damp, like the walls still held on to last winter. I unpacked slowly, checking the corners like I always do when I stay somewhere new. Everything seemed fine. There were heavy curtains on the windows and a back door that led to a small yard where the trees pressed close. The first night was uneventful. I cooked something small, read for a while, and went to bed early. The bed wasn't comfortable, but I didn't care. I slept harder than I had in weeks. It was the second night when things started to feel off. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. The room was quiet, but not the kind of quiet I expected. Usually, in the woods, you can hear crickets, frogs, the wind shifting through leaves. That night, there was nothing, just a heavy stillness. My skin prickled because silence like that doesn't feel natural. Then I heard it, a low sound, deep and drawn out. Took me a second to realize it was a howl. First, I brushed it off. Wolves live in some parts of the country, though it's rare to be close to them. I told myself it was probably a coyote, but the sound came again, closer this time. Not a yip or bark, but a long, steady call that carried through the trees. It raised the hair on the back of my neck. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. I didn't want to get up and look out the window, but I couldn't stop picturing something moving through the dark woods. After a while, I forced myself to pull the blanket tighter around me and try to sleep. My breathing eventually slowed, though every crack of wood in the cabin kept pulling me back from the edge of rest. The next morning, I went outside to clear my head. The ground was damp, leaves wet with dew. Near the edge of the yard, the soil was soft, and that's where I saw them, tracks. They were bigger than a dog's, deep enough to show weight. I crouched down and looked closer. My stomach tightened. These weren't from a stray dog. They were wide, with claws marked clearly at the tips. I knew what wolf tracks looked like, and that's what I was seeing. I tried to shake it off. Wolves don't usually come near people, and there was no reason for one to hang around. Still, I couldn't get rid of the unease. The prints circled part of the yard, like whatever had made them had walked around the cabin in the night. That evening, I double-checked the doors and windows. I made sure the back door was locked and pulled the curtains tight. It was already getting dark, and the woods felt closer than they had before. I sat on the couch with the lights on, trying to read, but my eyes kept drifting toward the windows. Every noise outside made me flinch. Hours passed, and I forced myself to bed again. I lay in the dark, waiting, listening, and then I heard it again, the howl. This time it was so close that the window glass seemed to hum with the sound. I froze, my chest tight. It wasn't far off in the distance. It was right there, near the trees at the edge of the yard. Then came another sound, movement. Slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. Something heavy pressed against the stillness, crunching branches as it moved. My pulse hammered. I imagined it circling the cabin again. I stayed still, trying not to breathe too loudly. My mind kept going back to those tracks in the dirt. I realized then that if the wolf was bold enough to come this close, it wasn't acting normally. Maybe it was hungry, maybe it was sick. The sounds went on for what felt like hours, then faded into silence again. I didn't sleep until the sun started bleeding light into the cracks of the curtains. The next day, I considered leaving. I even packed part of my bag, but stubbornness kept me there. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I wouldn't get my money back, that it was just an animal passing through. I wanted to believe that. That night, though, everything changed. I had just gotten into bed when the noise came again. Not a howl this time, but a growl. Low, guttural, vibrating through the walls. My throat went dry, I could hear claws scraping against the wood outside. Not random scratches, steady, dragging movements along the siding of the cabin. I sat up, heart racing. The sound moved from one wall to another, circling. Then I heard it near the back door, the click of claws on the porch boards. The door rattled once, hard enough to make me jolt. I stared at it through the dark, every muscle locked. The rattling stopped, and the silence after was somehow worse. I didn't move until dawn. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, I saw the marks. Deep scratches along the door frame, fresh gouges in the wood. More tracks in the dirt, larger than before, pressed deep into the soil as if something had been pacing for hours. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could and left without even cleaning up. Driving back down that narrow road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something breaking from the trees. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I looked up information about wolves in that region, I found out they weren't supposed to be there. People online said the population had been gone for years, wiped out or driven deeper into the mountains. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. It wasn't fear of some story or imagination. It was real. A wolf, bigger than it should have been, circling the cabin, testing the doors. And I still wonder what would have happened if the lock hadn't held. I booked the Airbnb because it seemed simple and quiet, exactly what I needed. It was a small house on the edge of a town I didn't know well, tucked behind some trees with a gravel driveway that crunched loud under my tires when I pulled in. The pictures online had made it look cozy. The host had kept the description short, just said it was a peaceful place to stay with all the basics. I didn't think twice about it. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked my bag, set my things on the dresser in the small bedroom, and took a walk around the property. The house had that slightly worn feeling, like someone had tried to make it look better in photos than it really was. The paint on the trim was chipping, the porch steps sagged a little, and the screen door slapped hard when it closed. Inside, the furniture was mismatched but functional. The fridge rattled when it kicked on, and the floorboards creaked even when I wasn't trying to make noise. Still, nothing felt wrong. I'd stayed in plenty of Airbnbs that weren't perfect. The second night was when I noticed something odd. I had picked up groceries earlier in the day, and I put everything neatly into the fridge. I had a small tub of ice cream that I'd been looking forward to. I placed it toward the back so it would stay cold, away from the door. When I came back late that night, I opened the freezer and saw that the lid was cracked open, and a scoop was missing. My first thought was that I must have forgotten and eaten some earlier, but I hadn't. I remembered putting it in untouched. The lid wasn't even closed properly. It was slightly tilted. That small detail unsettled me more than it should have. I brushed it off, thinking maybe the lid had shifted when I moved other things around. Maybe the freezer had been overstuffed. I tried not to let my mind wander. I shut the freezer, double-checked the lock on the back door, and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up to the faint sound of the fridge door closing. It was so light I almost thought I dreamed it, but when I walked into the kitchen, the freezer door was open just a crack again. A thin sheen of frost clung to the inside edge, and the ice cream tub was now clearly lower than I remembered. I didn't want to believe it, but it was obvious. Someone had been in there. I checked the doors and windows. All of them were locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints on the dusty porch, nothing disturbed in the living room. I told myself maybe the host had a spare key and had come in for something, though the thought made me sick. I didn't want to think about someone entering quietly while I was sleeping, standing in the same rooms, helping themselves to my food. That day, I didn't go out much. I stayed in, listening to the creaks of the house, watching the shadows shift across the walls as the sun moved. The air inside felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. When night came, I felt trapped. Every sound carried more weight. A car passed outside, crunching gravel. The fridge rattled again. At one point, I thought I heard the faint pad of footsteps above me, though the listing hadn't mentioned an upstairs. I sat in the dark for a long time, gripping my phone, debating whether to call someone. I finally fell asleep on the couch with the TV on low. When I woke up in the early morning, I walked to the fridge, and the ice cream was gone. Not partly gone, completely gone. The tub had been scraped clean and placed neatly back inside, lid pressed down tight. My stomach dropped when I saw it. Someone had stood in that kitchen while I slept just feet away. I checked the cabinets. Nothing else seemed touched, but I couldn't shake the image of a person standing in the dim light of the fridge, spoon in hand, watching me through the doorway. I packed my bag as quickly as I could, barely folding anything, just shoving it in. My hands shook so bad I dropped my keys twice on the way to the car. I didn't even look back at the house when I drove away. When I messaged the host later, I got nothing helpful. A short reply said something like, "Sorry this happened. Can't complain about the ice cream since it was left where it could be accessed. You may be able to recoup via air cover." That was it. No explanation about who had been in the house, no apology beyond that. It was clear they didn't care, or worse, they knew exactly what had gone on. I left a review, the lowest one I could. 1 star. I wrote out the details about the missing food, the unlocked feeling, the way things kept changing when I wasn't the one doing it. I didn't embellish, I didn't guess, I just described what had happened. Even now, weeks later, I think about that ice cream, about how it vanished completely without me ever hearing a thing. It wasn't about the food. It was about someone's presence, hidden but close, moving silently through the same spaces I thought were private. It makes my skin crawl to imagine how many nights they had been slipping in before I even noticed. That Airbnb looked ordinary on the outside, just another small rental on a quiet road. But I'll never forget the feeling of realizing someone had been inside, eating from my freezer, close enough to reach out and touch me while I slept. The house itself wasn't the problem. It was the fact that I'll never know who it was or how long they had been there. When I think about it now, I realize I left more than a bad review. I left a warning. That place isn't safe. I hope no one else ignores the little details the way I did. Because sometimes those little details are the only sign that someone is already inside. I booked the Airbnb because I thought it would be a quiet escape. It was supposed to be a small detached guest house behind a larger property, listed as private and self-contained. The listing photos showed a clean little unit with white walls, a basic kitchen, and a bed tucked against the corner. It looked fine, nothing fancy, but I wasn't looking for luxury. I just wanted a place where I could work on my laptop during the day and rest at night. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was that the photos had been generous. The paint was chipped, the corners of the bathroom were dark with mold, and the bedspread had an old smell like it hadn't been washed in weeks. I told myself it was fine, that it was only for a short stay, and I unpacked my bag anyway. I was tired from the drive, and I didn't want to deal with searching for another place. The first night passed quietly enough, though the sounds inside the unit kept me on edge. The fridge hummed loudly, and every time it shut off, the silence felt too heavy. The floor creaked in places I wasn't walking, but I tried to tell myself it was the building settling. I slept lightly, waking up at every shift of sound. The second night was different. I came back from a long walk and noticed that the front door, which I had locked behind me, was slightly ajar, just barely, maybe an inch open. I froze at the threshold, staring at the gap. I went over the steps in my head. I knew I had turned the lock, pulled the door until it clicked. I had even jiggled it to make sure, and yet it stood open. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. My bag was where I had left it, my laptop still on the small table, my clothes folded on the chair. I closed the door, locked it again, and told myself maybe I hadn't pulled it tight enough. But the thought that someone might have come in while I was gone wouldn't leave my head. That night, I barely slept. Every noise seemed louder. I kept staring at the crack under the door, waiting for shadows to move across it. At some point, I dozed off, but I woke up to the unmistakable sound of the bathroom faucet running. I shot upright, heart hammering. I stared at the bathroom door, half expecting it to swing open, but nothing happened. I crept closer and saw that the faucet handle was wet, the sink still damp, but the water was off. I hadn't touched it since the morning. The next day, I was rattled enough to consider leaving, but I convinced myself to stay. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe the door hadn't shut right, maybe the faucet had a leak, but in the back of my mind, I knew these weren't accidents. That evening, I decided to test something. I placed a small folded receipt halfway under the front door so it would move if anyone opened it. I also set a water bottle upright in front of the bathroom sink. Then I tried to relax, though my nerves were raw. When I woke up at 3 a.m., the receipt was gone. The water bottle had been knocked over on its side. Nothing else looked disturbed, but those two details were enough to make me break into a cold sweat. Someone had been inside again. Someone who knew how to move quietly, who took nothing but seemed intent on showing they had access. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in a chair, clutching my phone, staring at the door. Every creak of the building set my nerves on edge. I kept waiting to see the knob turn or the hinges move. When the morning light finally came through the thin curtains, I packed my bag as fast as I could. I felt exposed just being there, like whoever had been slipping in was watching me. My hands shook so much I dropped my charger 3 times before I stuffed it into the bag. I messaged the host later, trying to explain what had happened. The response I got was short, dismissive. Something like, "If that is a horror story, you should take your property off the platform." No concern, no apology, no explanation about who else might have had a key. Just cold dismissal, as if I was the problem for noticing. That reply made me feel worse than the nights in the house, because it told me the host either didn't care or was completely aware of what was happening. I left a review, 1 star, writing everything as it happened. I described the unlocked door, the wet faucet, the missing receipt. I didn't exaggerate or add anything extra. I just laid it out as it had unfolded. I wanted other people to know what they might walk into if they booked the place. Even now, I replay the details in my head. The door cracked open an inch, the faucet dripping in the middle of the night, the missing receipt I had set up as a test. None of those things should have happened without someone else being there. Whoever it was never took anything, never left obvious damage. They just made sure I knew in small ways that I wasn't alone. That was worse than theft. It was deliberate, controlled, like a game. When I finally checked out, I didn't look back at the unit. I just drove until I was far enough away that my chest started to loosen. But that feeling of being observed, of someone slipping into a locked space and leaving only traces, has stuck with me. I think about it at night sometimes in my own apartment when I hear a creak or when something is out of place and I don't remember moving it. That Airbnb taught me something I can't forget. Locks don't always mean safety, and privacy isn't guaranteed just because you paid for it. Sometimes the danger isn't in what's taken, but in the knowledge that someone can come and go whenever they want, without you ever catching them in the act. And the worst part is knowing that the host had no concern at all, because that makes me think they knew it was happening all along.